Hey everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo, and I would say I'm excited to share this review with you. But judging based on the past 72 hours of discourse, if you open any social media app, this is definitely a review that gives me a little bit of apprehension, a little bit of nerves. I love this film or hate this film, I feel like if you love this film and you put out a review, you should be nervous for the people who hate this film, and then if you hate this film and you put out a review, you should be nervous for the people that love the film that are going to come at you, because this film has been polarizing. Alien Romulus just came out a few days ago and has already started one of the biggest, most back and forth discourses amongst fans that I've seen, at least this summer, and in a broader sense, the last few years. I mean, this is some of the most polarizing, fan debating I've seen since the Last Jedi, even, which I'm not going to get into here because I know that also kind of opens another can of worms. But I just think it's so fascinating that movies from franchises that are so indoctrined into history and film history and have had so many generations to kind of stew and get new fans at different points in the timeline. You know, there are people who jumped on board at the very top with Alien, and then people who jumped on with Aliens, people who didn't come around to them until the sequels and the prequels. And I think it's very interesting to kind of look at the fandom at large and see where people's divides are, because a lot of people love it for its fan service. A lot of people hate it for its fan service. A lot of fans hate it because there's too much fan service and they want just something fresh and original. A lot of people who don't know the Alien franchise well hate it because they don't understand the fan references. And a lot of people who aren't Alien fans love it because they don't understand the references. So they're not references to them. They're just lines of dialogue. So I think there's just so many different webs and different connections you can make depending on where you are in your journey with Alien and the franchise at large and how you respond to this film. Now, this film, directed by Fede Alvarez, I haven't really loved all of his work that he's done. I didn't really like Evil Dead, his remake there, but I did like Don't Breathe. I did think that was a really successful horror film. That was actually the first horror film I saw when I moved to college in New York City. I went to Dolby Cinema. It was actually my first Dolby movie I ever saw on the big screen. Don't Breathe, and the sound design in that thing. Oh, it's so good and so icky. But I really, really like that film. So I had high hopes for Fede Alvarez. I think, if you're not going to get Ridley Scott, I think it's cool to bring in these directors who have a very, very polarizing and very distinct vision. I mean, you look at James Cameron, you look at David Fincher, who would like to tell you that, his film doesn't actually exist and that he didn't make it, but he did. And I think his style is definitely there in bits and pieces. And then you also have now Fede Alvarez, who's bringing his own stamp into this franchise. I've kind of liked how each of the Alien films has been so different from one another. You look at Alien, which is very much more your sci-fi horror. Then you look at Aliens, which is much more like your shoot 'em up action film. And I think it's very interesting to talk to people and just see what types of Alien films appeal to them, and also see what types of Alien films turn them off, because they're all so different and they all deal with so many different things. But overall, a lot of their themes are the same. I mean, the alien and what it represents in general, this kind of phallic image being the symbol for intrusion and male dominance and rape in a sense. And I think they really get into it, especially in Alien 3 and Alien Resurrection, when they talk about, Ripley's character and what lives inside her, quite literally, and how she has to kind of struggle with that, the fact that she is forced to go through with something that she didn't want. It's very topical, very political, and I think there's all that stuff in all the Alien films that you see. It's just every film does feel so distinctly different in how it approaches the material, which has been why Alien is always so refreshing to rewatch, especially in a binge, to kind of see, how each film distinguishes itself from the next, and that you can watch a certain Alien film without necessarily needing the marriage to the other Alien films. Like, you could watch Aliens and not necessarily need to watch Alien right before, and watch Alien 3 without having to watch Aliens right before. And actually, I think if you watch Alien 3 after having watched Aliens, it might even be worse. And I think that's actually a good kind of starting point to talk about my thoughts for Alien Romulus, because I rewatched all the Alien films this week. I binged them all. I didn't watch AVP. I haven't seen those films yet. But for the most part, I like the Alien movies. I don't really think there's any super, super offensively bad Alien films. The worst one, I think, is Alien Resurrection, only because I think the dialogue is bad and it's a little schlocky, but I still think there's some very interesting things textually and thematically that really, really makes it an interesting and engaging work. And I think, obviously Sigourney Weaver's great in it. So again, there's certain things about every Alien movie I like, and a lot of Alien movies I really, really love. But I think having watched all of them leading up to this film, which is a film so, married to its franchise and its fan service, it is very clearly a love letter to the franchise. It can be a little overwhelming at times, especially if you just sat through the entire binge and you're going into it and you're hearing lines of dialogue pop up every 5 minutes that you literally just heard the whole entire week building up to it. And I think that's where this interesting conversation of fan service comes from, because I honestly think, as much as it wants to say that, this is a movie for the fans. We made it for the fans, for you to share your love of Alien and celebrate your love for Alien. First of all, I think Alien is kind of a dark and cynical franchise. I don't necessarily know if like celebrating its legacy is really a great thing. I think these films are overall pretty dour and cold, which is why they're appealing. I think they have really dark things to say. And the fact that a lot of the times the humans don't win, especially with the Prometheus and Covenant films, like I really don't think this film necessarily needs that hoorah kind of energy. And that's where a lot of people are going to be like, well, Dylan, you loved the Star Wars sequel films and the prequel films, and the difference there is that Star Wars is literally a franchise about legacy, about storytelling through generations, about your familial past. So of course they're going to be callbacks. The callbacks are necessary for the story and they enrich in the experience. It's also a very hoorah, let's go adventure film series. So I think there's a difference between that and something a lot colder like Alien. Whereas in Alien, I feel like the overall franchise, the vibe of it doesn't necessarily lend itself well for those big pause moments for the audience to clap and say, oh my God, he said the line, he said the line. And there's so many moments like that in the film, not necessarily the holding for pause. There's one whole big pause that they take for an applause break, which I thought was just like one of the most like cringe things I've seen in a theater in a long time. But there are subtle references throughout. And I say subtle because I think if you haven't watched the Alien films in a long time, or you haven't watched them at all, I don't necessarily think you're going to get all the references. And I honestly wish I went into this more blind to the Alien franchise. I wish I hadn't rewatched the films, because I think if you rewatch the films, all the references are not really homages as much as they are poor imitations. And I think that's the thing is like, it's great when a franchise film pays homage to something, but when it does it in such an obvious and, big way, I think it definitely breaks your immersion. And that's another thing I want to talk about is immersion. And I think for this franchise, because it is so richly designed, I mean, all the different production design and all the lighting and just the atmosphere and the world building, that has always been a strength of the Alien films. And I think this film is no exception. I think Fede Alvarez does such a good job visualizing this film for the most part. There's one part that I'll talk about in a sec that I think is abysmal, but I think overall the sets and the construction, the practical effects of the aliens and the goo, I mean, they're really going hard for the, sexual metaphors here, because the alien looks as phallic as it can be. The goo, the pus, all of it, it's icky, it's gross, it's what you want from an alien film. That is 100% there. But that's where I talk about immersion. You can be immersed in the visuals of something, but every single time a character opens their mouth to say a line that I heard in Resurrection, or I heard in Covenant, or I heard in Aliens, or Alien 3, every time one of those lines is said by another character, it completely breaks my immersion. At least in the Star Wars films, and I'm bringing it back again because I think it's important to talk about, but especially in the Star Wars films, when they reference things, it's referencing things in the universe that have already happened. Here, Alien Romulus takes place between Alien and Aliens. So a lot of the callbacks are really call forwards to things that haven't happened, that these characters don't know have happened. And yes, I know characters can say whatever they want to say. They are not referencing the characters specifically, but as an audience who have sat through all these Alien movies, we've heard these lines time and time again. So it's very obvious, what they're trying to do. They're trying to make us, the audience, say, oh, I recognize that. Oh, I like that. Haha, I'm going to clap. And a lot of people, I think they expected a lot of people to clap in my theater, but as soon as some of these lines were said, I heard people going, like they don't want to hear that. And maybe there are people that want to hear that. Maybe there are people that just want to say, oh, I recognize that. I recognize that. But I think the Alien franchise especially has been so good about redefining itself with every chapter. And no chapter feels the same as the next. They do still feel a little stylistically similar, but the themes and the stories they're tackling are very, very different. As I said, Alien is a horror film. Aliens is an action film. And there's something really cool about that. But I think when you marry them together, it becomes a little tough, because I think, you're trying to really hit home the horror beats, but then because you also want to be an action film, you're trying to rush through it to get to the next exciting set piece. It's almost like those Halloween horror house, like Halloween haunted houses you go to at like Universal Studios, where every single room is from another horror movie you recognize, and you're like, oh, I recognize that. Oh, okay, I'm in this room, and then I'm in this room. It's kind of like that with this film, where you start in Alien, and then you move on to Aliens, and then, oh, you're in Alien Resurrection. Oh, now you're in Prometheus. Now you're in Covenant. Like, it really feels like one of those movies to me, and I just don't enjoy that. I just didn't find that part of it appealing. And yes, you can say, well, the references weren't very overt, and that's fair. They might not be overt if you haven't seen the movies in a while, but if you watch the movies all week like I did, I literally watched every single movie leading up to this. Every single reference, I could imagine the other characters in the other movies saying those lines, and it just broke my immersion. Now, speaking of breaking immersion, there's another element that I have to talk about. I praised Fede Alvarez's design, but there is one design element that just feels so cruel and so twisted and so disgusting. And it also just isn't visualized well at all. I'm not going to spoil what it is, but I'm sure if you've been on the internet, you probably know what it is. But it involves using CGI to basically revive the dead, which kind of feels icky in and of itself as a concept, but especially icky when it looks like absolute dog shit. And I think there's this one element of the film that if, it had been used for one little jump scare and then like that was it, I would have been like, okay, fine, whatever. But the fact is that this character that they resurrect from the literal dead, and I'm not talking about the character being dead, I'm talking about the actor being dead. They are resurrecting a dead actor by using their face, using their likeliness for their voice. And yes, they get the approval from the estate, but still, that doesn't mean it's pleasant to watch. That doesn't mean, again, that it doesn't break your immersion. And that's the thing. You can do all these things. There's no rule saying you can't. But for me as the viewer, it just totally took me out of it every time I saw it. And this kind of recurring character, recurring bit kind of recurs throughout the entire second act, going into the third act, even trickling into the fourth act. Like literally, they are introduced at the top of the second act, and then we see them kind of every now and then for the rest of the film, and it becomes so distracting to where every time I saw them, I was immediately just disengaged. And that's the problem with this film that I think, in comparison to a lot of other legacy sequels, really, really bothered me, because a lot of other legacy sequels, yes, they're very referential. They reference a lot of other things, but I think for this franchise, this has never been a franchise to really harken back to callbacks and quips from other movies. This is a film franchise that has always tried to set itself apart with every next installment while still staying true to the mythology in a way. And it's always been a franchise that has been completely immersive. And I think, yes, you can say we built practical sets and we made a practical xenomorph and everything's still ooey and gooey and sticky and gross. And that's awesome. That's great. But then when you stick the CGI character of a dead actor in the middle of the film and put his voice in there and give you kind of those shivers, it's not the shivers you want in a horror film where you're like, ooh, I'm spooked out. It's the shivers in the sense where you feel uncomfortable because you feel like this is disrespecting the actor. And yes, this actor may have loved the franchise. They might have loved their part in the franchise, and their estate may have given them permission. But for me as a viewer, it just broke my immersion, and there's nothing I can really help with that. Now, I've been harping on what doesn't work in this film, but I do want to kind of bring it around to what I do like. And I did talk about Fede Alvarez's design, and I do think his horror beats in general are pretty well executed. Now, I do think a lot of them are seen coming because a lot of them do kind of mirror other scares from other Alien movies, but there are a few sequences that I think do just feel very fresh and new. There's this scene with zero gravity and kind of the alien bodily acids that I think is really, really fascinating. I really like how that was designed. Again, I think this film looks really good, aside from the CGI recreation of that character, but I do think a lot of the other stuff does look very good. I think the camera work is fine. I think the lighting is really successful. Things are dark, but not too dark where it feels like we can't see anything, kind of like that episode of Game of Thrones or like actual Alien vs. Predator Requiem, which I have not seen, but I've seen scenes of, and well, I guess I have seen scenes of, but you can't actually see them because they're so dark. But I don't think there's any lighting problems. I think the sound is okay. I think the actual sound effects are great, but the sound mixing could have been a little bit better. Maybe it could be just based on how I saw it. I saw it in Dolby Cinema, so maybe everything was just a little louder than it needed to be, and it drowned out some of the dialogue. I also think the performances are really, really great. I think David Johnson is one of the biggest revelations of the last few years. If you haven't seen Rye Lane on Hulu, what are you doing? Go see it. He's amazing in it. It's one of the most charming rom-coms of the last few years, and I think he's really great in this film, kind of, again, continuing this trend of the android characters being far more interesting than the human characters, which I think serves a narrative purpose. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But we also have Kaylee Spaney, who is also very engaging. She is a human character, so I guess she's an exception to that rule. Isabella Merced also has some great, like, kind of final girl moments, even though she's not technically the final girl. But she does have, like, amazing screams and reactions to things that are really great. She's been an actress I've been a huge fan of for the last few years, ever since I saw her in Instant Family. I mean, she has so much range between Dora and this. I mean, it really is one of the greatest kind of early careers I've seen for an actor. Even though Madam Web is kind of that asterisk in the resume, she's still great in that film as well. And I think she's great here. She kind of has a lot of the bigger horror beats to act, so she kind of gets the most to do in terms of the horror of this thing. I think the rest of the actors are kind of disposable. I couldn't really distinguish a lot of them from one another. I mean, one's the tall one, one's the one with the thick accent, but there's really no distinct personality traits that I really latched onto like I did the other three that I mentioned. But the cast is fine. They work well with one another. You can feel the stakes. They they do make sure to make the stakes known for these characters and their relationships, which is nice to see. But I still feel like as invested as you could be in the characters and a lot of the sets and a lot of the atmosphere, at the end of the day, I think all the fan service of it all just really drowns it out for me, where I think the bad does unfortunately outweigh the good, to where I also think because I was so disengaged, I was almost a little bit bored by it. And I didn't expect that going in. I expected, a lot of fan service, but I expected to at least be entertained because I am a fan. But I think because I am such a big fan, every little reference took me out of the thing, to where I was just kind of like, all right, let's get on to the next part. Let's get on to the next part. And I will say the final act, the fourth act, if you will, because these films always have four acts, where they kind of go to the third act, they finish the film, and then it's like, oh, one last twist. I think that fourth act, although it is kind of a copycat of Alien Resurrection, if you watch Alien Resurrection, you know why. But I do think, despite being a little bit of a copycat of Alien Resurrection, I think what they do in terms of the horror of it is really successful. I think it has one of the greatest jump scares ever, period. So like I said, there's stuff I like about this film. It's just there's so much I don't, that distracts me, or not even distracts me, but just takes me out of it. And I think that's the problem with this franchise in particular. Is this is a franchise I've always been so, drawn into, and wanting to just explore this world and be immersed with these characters and these sets and this, whole world that they've set out. But when you have a character front and center that's AI, of a dead resurrected actor, that's just so icky, especially when the whole theme of the franchise is that, corporations try to play God and take control of these humans and basically use them for their own financial benefit. I mean, it feels pretty blatant that that's what they're doing with this actor by resurrecting them from the dead and kind of playing God and bringing them back to life. It just feels a little hypocritical in a way. And I know there could be a commentary to be made of that. Like maybe that's what the intention was, to show that like this is what corporations do. But I don't give it to Disney that they'd be smart enough to actually like make that a point to do that in service of the themes. I think it's just a pretty poor coincidence, in my opinion. It really is a shame because I really wanted to like this film. I tried so hard. After that first act, the first act is honestly really strong. I was really set with these characters. I was really excited to see where they would go. But then there's like this recurring gag amongst Alien fans where in every film it seems like they smoke in space, and that's one thing you just like can't do. They like light up cigarettes in space, and it's kind of one of those really funny things that Alien fans have kind of caught on to, that they actually make a point to like kind of revisit in every movie. That is an example of like fan service that I think might work. Like that is a very subtle thing that unless you are a die hard Alien fan, you're not necessarily going to pick up on. But this film, instead of just like including a scene where they're smoking in space, right as they take off, the character quite literally lights his lighter and a huge flame bursts into flames. And that's exactly when I knew like, oh, this is kind of the movie I'm going to be in for, because that's the example of what I'm talking about. Is it's not this like subtle little fan servicey things here and there that make up kind of like this kind of really niche little Easter egg hunt. It really are these huge overt callbacks like that, like the giant flame. It's like you couldn't just light a cigarette. It had to be this giant flame to draw attention to, hey, guess what? We're making the joke. You get it? You get it? Wink, wink, wink. You see, we're lighting a flame in space. We can't smoke in space. Get it? Get it? And it's one of those things where I'm just like, okay, I get it. I get it. I get it. And I feel like this movie has so many of those examples. I kind of want to get into some of them because I wrote some of them down after the theater. I sat in my car and I was like, what are some of the lines that I could think of? I'm just going to rattle off a few of them. So if you don't want to know what some of the references are, I guess you could tune out now. As you can gauge, I didn't really love this movie, but I am gonna kind of just list off some of the other franchise callbacks, just because I think there is a world where if you haven't seen the films in a while, these could be exciting, fresh little Easter eggs for you. But I think as someone who watched all these films, these were very distracting. Of course, Andy, he uses the famous line, "I prefer the term artificial person myself," which again is a callback to Bishop and Aliens.
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
You have Andy calling them busy little creatures, which of course is the same line that Carter Burke says in Aliens.
Busy little creatures, huh?
Of course, you have the protopulse rifle when Taylor is trying to show Rain how to use the gun, which is straight out of Aliens when Hicks shows Ripley how to use it. Another reference, obviously, the black goo from Prometheus. Again, probably wouldn't have been the worst callback, except they put the literal score from Prometheus over the top in a very loud way, where it's like, okay, I get it. We're getting to Prometheus now. I get it. It's one of those things, again, where it's like, they almost feel like you don't understand the references, so they have to make sure you know the references. They have to, like, hit you over the head with it. Of course, we get kind of a recreation of the face-to-face scene from Alien 3. The big one is, of course, "Get away from her, you bitch."
Get away from her, you bitch!
And they just take the most annoying long pause before he says "you bitch," which also doesn't make sense because, like, everything we know about Andy up till then, there's no sort of reasoning why that character of all people would be calling someone else a bitch. Again, like, whatever, characters are free to curse, but it just makes no sense that that is the character that would use profanity when he is so, innocent and so kind and so gentle and warm-hearted. It's one of those things where even as defensive as he is of his sister, I just don't know if he would be the one to say that line. And if you just said get away from her, fine. But the fact that you have to add that you bitch, it's just, it's fan service. And that's the one that got the biggest groans from my theater. Of course, the whole final monster, while very cool and very gross, this human alien hybrid, it's been done before in Resurrection. I think this one is designed better and is a little scarier than Resurrection, which is why I kind of give that a free pass. I wrote down, of course, Science Officer Rook literally being Ash from the first Alien film, played by Ian Holm in a resurrected role. This is the performance I was alluding to earlier. I guess I shouldn't say performance because he's not actually performing. There are people kind of recreating his body and voice, which is just so icky to me. But it's also like that role could have been anyone. It could have been any actor. It could have just been a model of this robot, this android, or it could have been the same actor who plays Andy, have David Johnson playing another model, or it could have been Michael Fassbender. It could have been a variant or an android model of David. It could have also been Winona Ryder, who is also a model that we would see in a future film in Alien Resurrection. It could have been Bishop himself. Like, he's still alive. This is the one actor that they could have chosen that's played an android in this franchise that has died. I might be wrong on that. You might have to fact check me, but there are plenty of other actors that are alive. There are plenty of other actors that might even be able to look like him if you just want him to play the role. I mean, we recast Han Solo. Alden Ehrenreich didn't have to be deep fake to look like Harrison Ford. He was just a different take on the character. And Rook even says his line that he says in the first Aliens. He says, "I can't lie to you about your chances." Quite literally the exact line he says in the first movie.
I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
And those are just some of the references that I wrote down after the theater, but I'm sure there's even more. And again, it's fine for a film to kind of give a little callback and a little wink, but when it does it so obnoxiously to where it really feels like it's trying to hit you over the head with them, that's where I feel like it was just a little excessive. And it did, like I said, time and time again, it broke my immersion. And that's the saddest thing, because this is one of those franchises I really, really love. And I really wanted to love this film, as I said. But there's really not much else I can say about it. Again, I'm a little bit bummed out. I actually think I want to revisit this when I haven't watched all the Alien films leading up to it, because I do think when taking this on its own, it might actually play a little bit better. That's why I push back on the whole statement that this movie is for the fans, because I honestly think if you've never seen an Alien film and you don't necessarily know that these are all callbacks and these aren't necessarily taking you out of your own headspace and making you think about other movies, I honestly think it probably works much more successfully, because it is scary at times. It is scary when you don't necessarily know the beats that are going to happen because you've seen them in other movies. So I really do think there is an audience that can enjoy this. And this is kind of my overall thoughts, is that yes, we can like something, we can not like something, but that doesn't mean that everyone is going to agree with us. There are going to be people out there who love this film. I'm not one of them, but I know there are people, even who host this channel and co-host this channel, who love this film. And I think it's because we all have different various ways we approach the franchise. We all have different familiarities with the franchise, and we have different things that kind of break our immersion or not. Maybe this fan service is what kind of immerses us even deeper into the world, that convinces us like this is an Alien movie. But sometimes, fan service works differently on other people. Like I said, I love the Star Wars sequels because they do harken back to old things from Star Wars lore, but the films are all about the lore, all about the world building through family and generations, where I feel like Aliens has never really been that. It never really feels like it needs to kind of marry itself to other iterations. It just kind of feels like it needs to be that iteration in and of itself. I feel like the power of Alien is that Ripley can go to sleep in one film and then wake up in the next, and it's a whole different vibe, a whole different change of pace. And yes, maybe those first 5 or 10 minutes we can address what happened the movie before, but now we're in our own thing. We're kind of locked and loaded, ready to go with our own separate journey. And that's what has always been so refreshing about the Prometheus and Covenant films, is because I feel like none of that has to be at all married to the future of Alien. Yes, we can kind of explore the origin of these xenomorphs, but we don't really have to mention any of the other human characters, really. All we have to explore is the xenomorph, which is kind of this kind of common thread. Whereas here, I feel like they try to explore and bite off way more than they can chew. I do think Fede Alvarez has potential as a filmmaker to be someone who really delivers, especially in the fright and the horror aspects of things. I almost wish if he had stuck completely to the Alien side with the horror and not gone as gung-ho with the action, I think this might have been more successful. Or if he had gone full throttle action and maybe toned it down a little bit in the horror. The problem is the action makes it so that the film just moves a mile a minute and feels like it's moving too fast. And the horror itself, I think because it's moving fast, can't properly sink in because a lot of the anticipation, a lot of the buildup is missing because it feels like it's moving a mile a minute. I think that first half hour is really, really good because it's really setting the stage. It's really letting things bask, letting things marinate, letting things ruminate. But then once we kind of hit the ground running, we really run and it doesn't feel like we have the room to stop and breathe. So that is my review for Alien Romulus. Again, I'm bummed. I really, really wanted to like this one. I just didn't. And I think that's just kind of what we are as film fans. We like some things, we don't like some things. And I think this whole discourse has been very, very upsetting to see because I think people should be allowed to love this movie and champion this movie. And people should be able to be critical of this movie at the same time. I am very critical of this movie. So I hope people give other people the respect that I would hope to give anyone in this scenario, where if you love the movie, I'm so happy you did. And I really would love to know why, because I want to see it through those lenses. You know, as someone who doesn't like the movie, trust me, I want to like the movie. I want to be you. I want to be that person. But I also think if you are someone who loves the movie, don't put someone down who doesn't, and don't say, I think you're misunderstanding it. I don't think you understand what this, you know, we are all different. We all have different ways of approaching and engaging with material. And this is just one of those films that I didn't engage with as well as I wish I could have, because for me, immersion and engagement kind of go hand in hand. And I didn't feel that immersion to be engaged fully with the film. But I do really, really hope someday I'll come around to it, because I do think there are glimmers of greatness there. Again, that zero gravity sequence is so freaking cool. That jump scare is freaking epic. Like, there are great things about this film. It's just, in all, it didn't necessarily work for me. So let me know in the comments what you thought of Alien, and please be kind. I kind of want to do a ranking, but I feel like that's even going to be more polarizing because I have a film at number one that I don't necessarily know if a lot of other people do. But maybe I'll do it on TikTok. We'll see. But either way, stay tuned. Wednesday is going to be Furiosa, which is going to be very exciting because I feel like that's a film a lot of people just like. I feel like there's not a ton of people who are like, that film sucks. So I think it'll be a little bit more refreshing to talk about Furiosa because, spoiler alert, I did like it. So I'm excited to talk about that on Wednesday. It's streaming on Max now. You can go watch it. And Alien Romulus is still playing in theaters, so go check it out if you're curious. Again, I think there are people who are going to really like this film. There are people who aren't. I think if you haven't seen a lot of Alien films in a while, don't rewatch them before you watch this film, because I think you're going to like it more if you don't have those callbacks necessarily in the front of your brain. Or if you want to think of it as a cool experiment, watch the film, then go back and watch all the Alien films, and then go see it again and see if your perspective shifts. We'll see how that works. I just think it's a very interesting conversation to have, regardless of whether you liked it or not. So thank you for being along for the ride here. This is a little bit of a longer review than usual, just because I'm kind of spitting my brain and my mind out, because I really don't have any sort of outline or rubric or notes that I'm really reading off of. I just have my list of Easter eggs. So it's been a little bit of a ramble fest for me, but I appreciate you giving me your time, and you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, and we'll see you Wednesday for Furiosa.